All right. It is such an honor and a privilege to have with me today's guest, Mitchell Barak. It's not often that I get to speak to such a world-renowned expert, a pollster. He's called Israel's Uber pollster. He worked for several Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, several ministries, quoted New York Times, Washington Post, and across the media as one of Israel's most respected pollsters. And he is going to share with us some perspectives on Israel's current politics, how they affect the relationship of Israel with Jews around the world, and how the impact of Israeli politics is seen in the context of American politics, what the interplay is. So first of all, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here from Jerusalem and discuss these important issues today.
All right, so first of all, we've seen today that Israel may be going towards a new government. And I'd love to hear from you how you think, if such a government is formed, how you think that might impact the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews.
Well, I like to say I'll believe it when I see it, meaning it's great that Naftali Bennett has now almost decided. Like, I don't even think he's fully decided to go with Yair Lapid, meaning he says he's fully decided, even though this morning after breakfast, he was having some second thoughts. He called Rav Druckman to kind of give him some insight. And he was talking to Netanyahu, maybe doing a triple rotation with Sar, He was ready to do it. He said, he does not look like a leader. He does not look ready. He does not look like a man with an agenda. He does not look like the coalition of change that he's supposed to be leading and representing, which are people who say Netanyahu is toxic, Netanyahu has to leave, Netanyahu is destroying the very fabric of this country. So when Bennett made his statement, he kind of alluded to the disunity or the hatred that Netanyahu perpetrates. But if Netanyahu came with an offer next week, before this government is sworn in, I'm not convinced that Bennett would still go with Lapid. And I think in any kind of normal circumstance, if Lapid was really controlling things and really a person who was putting himself first, he would say, Bennett, decide to be with us or get out, and they would have thrown him out already. So it's not a good start to this government, and I'm not convinced it's going to happen until it really happens. Now, to your question, which is how is it going to affect diaspora Jewry? I think it's going to be very, very interesting because it looks for the first time that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, the two Haredi parties, the Shas party representing the Sephardic Jewry, and the Aguda party representing both the Lithuanians and the Hasidic communities are not going to be in the government. And that's going to change the way things in the government of Israel look, not just in terms of budget, but in terms of legislation, in terms of even religious coercion, in terms of marriage, meaning some kind of civil marriage or partnership is on the table. That's going to change, as well as attitudes towards Reform and conservative Jewry in America and all Jews in America and elsewhere. And that's going to be significant, especially since the Labor Party has an actual Reform rabbi on the list. So I think that's going to be a welcome thing, because the whole issue of the Kotel compromise, which Netanyahu promoted and then slyly revoked, and the disrespect that Israel shows to many in the diaspora Jewish community who are not Orthodox, I think that's going to go. If I would sum up the Israel-diaspora relation in one line, I would simply say it is a relation of carrots and sticks. Diaspora Jewry gives us the carrots, and we give them the sticks.
Oh, that's a tough one to swallow. I want to go from what you're saying to the what I call the Dermer doctrine. Ron Dermer gave a very, very viral and sensational interview. He was at the Korishon panel, and he said, look, this was his argument. You have diaspora Jews, which are about 2% of America, and of those, Reform Jews are a third. And on the other hand, you have evangelical Christians who are about 25% of America and are fierce and unquestioning supporters of Israel. And to quote directly, I believe he said, they are the backbone of support to Israel. What do you say to that argument? Seems like it has the math, or what do you say?
Well, I mean, it is true that the evangelicals are certainly a backbone of support from Israel. We're not arguing with that. We're not even arguing that they are ardent supporters of Israel. I think that under Prime Minister's leadership, with Ambassador Dermer representing Israel, I think for a long time, and it's not just Israel, but it's many of the right of center settlement, organizations. We've sold our birthright for a bowl of evangelical lentils. I mean, that's what it comes down to. We've embraced the evangelical community, which is great because they have a certain feeling for Israel. And the reason we like them so much is because they don't hassle us on the settlements. They think that, we're right to settle that land. So that for us, they're low-hanging fruit. But at the same time, the majority of the Jewish community doesn't fit into that conservative, politically conservative mentality. The majority of the Jewish community has been traditionally liberal Jews, Jews that believe in equality and democracy and other things that for some reason Israel doesn't seem to be representing or doesn't seem to be promoting in these areas. And we've ignored them. In fact, a lot of the money and a lot of the donations and a lot of the relationship comes from these people in these communities. But they're not comfortable for many of us because they provide criticism or because they want to see Israel a different way or because the settlements becomes that main issue that so many people are uncomfortable with. So, we have a lot in common in Israel with the Democratic Party and people that have liberal and progressive ideas. We're open to all types of people, all types of Jews that immigrate. There is equality between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but we have a court system. I mean, we have a lot of things that we can really sell to them. And we don't because we've tended not to care. And, for Netanyahu, certainly with Obama, President Obama, who did some, amazing things for Israel and who also tried to be more even-handed or even took the side of the Palestinians. We've interpreted that, or we kind of brainwash everyone into thinking that anytime someone wants to further the peace process or talk about, what's been going on in these settlement communities for the past 54 years is anti-Israel. And we can't take criticism and we can't even discuss it. And that's a problem. And that's a weakness of Israelis that we can't do that. So, I heard Ambassador Dermer speak. I think as an Israeli taxpayer, I was disappointed, if not, sort of disgusted by it, that, the ambassador of Israel is running what we call in election campaigns the Southern strategy. He's going after the white, overweight, evangelical, Southern males and their spouses for support of Israel and just disregarding everyone else, figuring we'll win the election with these people and everyone else cannot. And I think Israel has to ask themselves, did we help cause this, kind of uprising or this kind of growth of the progressives who are not favorable towards Israel over the past few years by ignoring them? So that's the question I would ask you or, some of the US supporters there, if that's what happened.
Right. So I guess that's the big question. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it that progressive Jews became less supportive of Israel, and that's why Israel turned to evangelicals, or did many Jews get turned off from supporting Israel by Israel's shift towards evangelicals? And it's probably a combination of both. I would say that one of the biggest things that I'll actually share with you a story that I had a personal encounter with Ron Dermer. There was a group of rabbis that was meeting with the embassy about the topic of support for Israel. And it was shortly after a certain president of the United States said that Jews who vote Democrat are disloyal. And, some people took that as offensive from one way, some took it from the other. So I said to Ron Dermer then, I said, listen, my brother lives in the West Bank. Israel has my full support 100%. I'm a Democrat. And my question is, why is it that after he said, after he sort of smeared and lashed out at American Jews who are not Republicans, why is it that not one Israeli official was able to say, we love Jews regardless of what party they vote for? Why is it that no Israeli official, and it didn't have to be the prime minister because that can create an international episode, why couldn't even someone from Meretz get up and say, this is ridiculous to smear American Jews as disliking Israel or not caring about Israel for the sake of cheap political points? Why wasn't there any response? And unfortunately, there was no response. He smiled, but there was no response.
Well, I think people were afraid. I assume you're talking about President Trump, but people were, it was like walking on eggshells with him. You didn't want to get him too angry. So I think people tried to stay out of the firing line there and kind of let him do what he wants. But, I think for a long time, even if you see what's going on now, it's absolutely ludicrous in the Israeli politics that the whole issue of Bennett joining this government is because it's left. We have these definitions that are meaningless. Oh, Bennett said he's going with the right. He's never going to go with the left. Yair Lapid is left. There's no difference. There's no real difference between what Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz believe in and what Netanyahu and what Bennett believe in. Maybe on certain things there are, but Netanyahu is the master of disguise. I mean, he's the guy that implemented the Oslo Accords. He's the guy that withdrew from the last hills of Hebron. Okay, the hills around Hebron, as you remember. He's the one that went to Wai River and met with Arafat. He's the one that actually supported the disengagement. He only resigned a month before the disengagement. He was in Sharon's government as the finance minister. He voted for it during the cabinet meetings, okay? And he made sure that it was well financed until he left. So he always comes in as this right-wing individual and someone who stands for the state of Israel and all this, but nothing could be further from the truth. In addition, he's freed more terrorists than any prime minister in the history of the state of Israel. And he facilitated $45 million in cash from Qatar to pay the Hamas over the past 2 years, which is how they got their weapons and how they built their tunnels. So he's a big talker. When there's terror attacks, he says he's going to cut off the tax money that we are supposed to pay them, but legally he can't do that. He's just talking. So he's a big talker. There's no difference between left and right. And we're stuck in this thing now about left and right when the country is not functioning. There's no budget. We're still fighting coronavirus. We had this, thing with Gaza, which, I think we used up a lot of our credit line everywhere in the world when it comes to Iran and the real issues, because the real threat was not the Hamas rockets. It just wasn't, and it won't be. It's a nuisance, it's bad, but it's not, a strategic threat against Israel. And we've used up a lot of this, thanks to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so there's real work for a government to do, and it doesn't matter left or right, because Netanyahu's current government includes 3 people from Labor, Amir Peretz. It includes Orly Levy, who is also with Labor. He's just as we say in Hebrew, a kashkashan. He's a talker. He's a great talker. And the same things he was accusing Bennett tonight is like he's looking in the mirror and talking at himself.
I guess looking forward, whatever government it may be, what do you think Israel can do to engage a broader audience, especially in the United States, especially with the rise of progressives in the United States? Looking long term, what can Israel do to have not the Dermer approach, but a broader approach that includes more people? How can it market itself better and reach a broader audience?
Well, we need to have a more inclusive message, certainly in Israel, for Israelis and with diaspora Jewry. I think that's the first thing is to respect diaspora Jewry, and I think for a lot of Israelis, they don't respect members of the Reform movement. They don't respect the conservative movement. They don't respect the unaffiliated. They'll trash people that are intermarried. They'll talk about that there's no future of for Jews in America. And I think one of the greatest tragedies of all, and I'd like to understand why American Jewish leaders don't stand up for their rights. Why do you continually let Israeli leaders and regular Israeli citizens keep telling you to make Aliyah? Why? I mean, you work at Park East, and that's a synagogue that's been around for 130 years, and it's going to be around 130 years more. Why do American Jews let Israelis tell them to make Aliyah and insult their communities? the strength of Israel is going to be a strong diaspora community. And you shouldn't let people treat you as second-class citizens. Now, we think of you as second-class citizens because that's how our Zionist education or brainwashing, whatever you want to call it, is. We're the better Jews. We're in Israel. We're the future of the Jewish people. We're fighting for everyone. And you're in New York and Miami and Toronto and everywhere else, and you're not as good as us. And until you move and really understand our pain, then you can be on the same level as us. Don't treat yourself as second-class citizens. Let's start with that.
So in terms of engaging with Jews in the diaspora, you think just a more leveled conversation and respect would engage a broader audience? That would be in the Jewish community. How do you think Israel can reach out where you have people like introducing a bill to boycott weapons sales to Israel, something that no one would have thought of 5 years ago? What do you, and she got a bunch of co-sponsors, not many, but a handful. What do you do in such a situation? What do you do to make sure that support for Israel remains strong and bipartisan in a broader audience?
Well, I think that one of the great policies of Netanyahu over the past 10, 12 years that he's been in now is to make sure that nothing happens on the Palestinian front. And nothing happens. Make sure we keep building and building and building, and we don't have any discussions, and we keep calling them terrorists. And it's true that Abu Mazen is not the best partner. And Abu Mazen, when his security forces want to cooperate with Israel, they do a good job, but they're also paying terrorists. Meaning, I get what's happening, but at the same time, now we could have used Obama after we had that war with Gaza, and Fatah and Abu Mazen didn't join in. Netanyahu could have taken Abu Mazen with Obama and gone to Saudi Arabia and all these countries and said, let's solve this problem, because the real problem for Israel is the Iranian issue. So let's get rid of the Palestinian problem and let's solve it. He could have done that. He could do that now that we have the Abraham Accords. Take the United Arab Emirates, take Saudi Arabia, say, let's solve this problem. Meaning, at least if there was some movement with the Palestinians and we could treat them with some dignity and respect, which I think is lacking, and listen to what they're saying. There was a great article in the New York Times. I know everyone in New York loves to keep canceling their subscription of the New York Times so that they can renew it. And the reason they do it is actually they get the new readership discount, but they won't tell you that. I'm a new reader. I canceled a month ago, and so that they can cancel again. They have a good reason. But there was an article about how we don't treat the Palestinians with dignity, or that the indignities that they have to go through, whether it's in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. So we need to move forward with the Palestinians in some way and take it seriously. And we're not doing that. And as long as we're not doing that, I don't think we have a great message for the progressives, because that's where they see the problem.
Got it. I think an example that really highlights that is also, there are many, no one wants to be a bad Jew, right? Every Jew wants to be helpful to everyone and to their fellow Jews, and definitely to Israel. And I think that the message Israel, whether silently or loudly, is sending is, if you really want to support us, be a Republican. And I'll give you an example of how that can be a real disaster. You used to have in the Bronx, you had Elliot Engel. He was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a huge community there, very pro-Israel. And
he's the New Rochelle. He represents New Rochelle and Westchester. He did.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Right.
So I asked someone who's, has kids in Israel, everything, very pro-Israel. I said, he lost the primaries in your neighborhood. Did you vote? And he said, no, I'm a Republican. I support Israel. I'm a Republican. And I'm like, God Almighty, you just unsat Elliot Engel and got someone else who's much less pro-Israel, because you think you're being helpful by being a Republican. So I think Israel strategically needs to make it clear that it needs people that are friends of Israel to be in the Democratic Party, because otherwise you can't live off support in one party.
That's correct. And that's unfortunately is we don't have a bipartisan approach anymore. And, it's a problem, because now look where it's at. And we have a president who, Joe Biden is a great friend of Israel, and he has been for 40 years. But look at how Israelis and Israeli leadership spoke about him during the election. Look at how the Jewish community spoke about him, all the Republicans. We heard the same stupid story about Menachem Begin saying to him, 40 years ago, come on. The guy worked his life in the Senate for Israel and the Jewish people. Everyone loves to say, you know, everyone's so thrilled Trump would never hurt Israel because he has Jewish grandchildren. Biden has more Jewish children and grandchildren and in-laws than anyone. Nobody talks about that. No one wants him to be part of the club, and no one wants to, no one wants to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's been a great friend of Israel, and he believes it, and Netanyahu knows that. But nobody was going to come to his defense during the election, and he was a great. Netanyahu likes to have a kind of frenemy. Obama was great for him because he could be the guy that stood up to Obama. But it's a problem that within the Democratic Party, you don't have, again, a lot of the Jews that make the most noise are in the Republican Party. But I think if you look at, campaign financing and where money is going, it's still going to the Democratic side and it's going to the Republican side. So there are definitely activists. But, then you had, the late Sheldon Adelson, a bully, an absolute bully who used his money to try and buy elections and influence people. I mean, if you look at the list of who gave money in each of these elections, of course, when he was alive, he clocks in almost every election at $150 million. Yeah, that's what it is. And it's all through Republican candidates. And it's just, we're taking, it's based in support of Israel. But at the same time, I think we're picking one side, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Oh, wow. That is definitely a unique perspective. I appreciate it. I think something changed in the past few weeks. I know, obviously, things in the diaspora can be compared to Israel. It's sort of apples and oranges. And, people in the kibbutzim near Gaza have to jump into bomb shelters and there was rockets falling. Nonetheless, diaspora Jewry has taken a very big hit in the past 2 weeks. There's been an increase in 400% in anti-Semitism in the UK and 200% in the United States. It looks like the United States is going more towards a place like Jewish communities are in Europe, where you need security next to synagogues, you need heavy security next to Jewish schools. How do you see that changing American Jewry? I know you're an expert on Israel and politics, but how do you see that changing things for American Jewry? Do you think that's going to reshape any of the thinking in American Jewry?
Well, I'll take a little bit of a more cynical approach here and a more, I think, realistic approach. There's no question what's been going on in the U.S. is scary. I think there's obviously a connection. Why in the past 2 weeks has this been spiked? Because of what's going on between Israel and Gaza. I mean, it doesn't look great for Palestinian supporters when Israel sends 1,000 warplanes to bomb in civilian areas that look like Manhattan or look like the Bronx. It doesn't look great, and people want to identify. Now, as long as there's a lot of Palestinian Americans that are doing this, right? Or a lot of Arab Americans that are doing this now.
Yes, many, and then in Canada and England, really.
Right. So let's look at it. Let's look at this. Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza, okay, they're involved in car rammings, stone throwings, knifings, Molotov cocktails, and those things. And you're telling me the Palestinians in America are having verbal assaults, yelling at Jews in the street, occasional beatings here and there, or throwing bricks through synagogue windows at night when no one's there, or attacking dead Jews in cemeteries. Now, I'm not making light of it, but it's not, there's not a real danger here. And until Pittsburgh and San Diego, there was really few to no fatalities. And so what we're talking about is connected to Israel. Within 2-3 weeks, you're not going to see it anymore. And the Jews in New York are going to be not in Manhattan, a lot of them. And, everyone's going to be summer and vacationing. And as things quiet down in Israel, this is going to quiet down here. So for people to say that they're being verbally assaulted on the street, it's horrible. And America has to stop, make sure that this stops. But the real danger, you want to talk about danger? There's 2,000 terror attacks on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, where your brother lives, every year. 2,000. There's Lod, there's Yaffo. So I find it disingenuous and real Israeli chutzpah when Israelis love to post on Facebook stand strong, but really pack your bags because, it's really dangerous there. It's not dangerous for Jews in America, no matter how you look at it. It's just not. It is much more dangerous for Jews here to live in Israel. That's a statistical fact based on the number of terror incidents, the number of fatalities. So what you're going through now is scary. It has to be managed. You should use that same policies that Israelis use, which is stand up and fight and don't run away. Don't reward anti-Semitism in America by talking about Aliyah in the New York Times article. Don't reward anti-Semitism by saying we're preparing to make Aliyah because we don't feel safe here. Stand up and fight and don't give up. And I think that's the wrong perspective that American Jews are having. And it's actually fueling more and more anti-Semitism. It's a defeatist attitude. But at the end of the day, I also think there's not a real present and clear danger. And I'll add just finally as one addendum, the real people that they're beating up in America now and killing are Asians. Is anyone really concerned with Asian Americans being beat up and being shot? Because that's what's happening. Okay. And I told a friend of mine recently, it's much more likely, it's 1,000,000 times more likely that a black male in police custody dies than a Jew dies in the streets of the United States of America. So I think we need to have some perspective here. It's not an easy time, but let's really take a closer look at it.
So I appreciate this perspective, and it definitely has a lot of validity. I would like to take a difference and just highlight one thing. So in Israel, when someone's being attacked, whether it's by rockets or Molotov cocktails, etc., yes, that is more dangerous than being beaten on the streets of Manhattan. But from the perspective of Jewish life and Jewish identity, the Israeli in Israel, in fact, is probably more likely to express his Judaism after such an attack, as opposed to in the diaspora. The second you have even a small amount of attacks on visibly Jewish people, that decreases the number of people willing to go to synagogue. It decreases the number of people willing to identify as Jews on campus. It decreases any form of Jewish life that's in public. There's all the people talking about taking off their kippah, hiding their Star of David. And in that sense, I think it's a much greater danger than in Israel, because you have the assault on the very expression of being Jewish.
I will agree with that, and I'll say that it is very scary. And again, I think it's very much connected to what's going on in Israel. If there was no state of Israel, would there be these kinds of attacks? I'm not sure. And
before 1948, so my guess is
right. So we don't know. I think we also have to separate. Verbal assaults are terrible. They're uncomfortable, but they're verbal assaults. And vandalism against shuls, it's a terrible thing. And it's a horrible feeling. But again, it's not something that, until, and again, the atmosphere or the avirah, I don't know, atmosphere doesn't really set it, during the Trump administration, where you had people who actually went into synagogues to kill people. I mean, you hadn't had that before, okay? And again, the Palestinian community, there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Michigan and Chicago and this. Are any of them committing terror attacks? Are any of them doing stabbings in malls? They could create bombs there pretty easily. The one guy they got for beating that guy up in Times Square, and they beat him up, and he tried to fight back, and I give that to him, is he said, if I could do it, I would do it again. What? He couldn't take a knife? He couldn't, be a real martyr in America? No, because the tones are lower in America, and they're not good. If you have that same level of terror that exists here, then I would really be concerned, and then I would be vigilant. But the response to a Pittsburgh or the response to San Diego is to move more Jews in. Exactly what you do in the West Bank when they attack a settlement. You say, we're going to build another settlement. So put more people in those communities, be more vigilant, train people with weapons, and start to act like proud Israeli Jews. And not Americans who say, we have to make Aliyah. You see, I told you, I have a file on Nefesh B'Nefesh, and I'm going to renew it because I'm afraid. Yeah, this is gonna die down. The summer is coming. Israel's going to have a new government or the same government or go to elections, and you'll see that this is not, as great a threat as people are feeling now.
Again, my concern is not so much a Hasidic Jew from Brooklyn who got beat up in the Diamond District is still going to wear his yarmulke, etc., and go to work. The concern is Jews who are on campus afraid to go to Hillel, Jews that are in public school and are told we won't sit with Zionists. those are the really concerning elements where people disassociate from Jewish life together. In Israel, you don't really have the option to assimilate easily, right? You're not going to go in the West Bank to the guy throwing a Molotov cocktail and say, oh, I'm actually not Jewish. I'm just like something neutral. In America, you do have that option. And if many people get that feeling, then we've lost a chunk of our people to this kind of violence.
Yeah, but at the same time, some people become more emboldened with their Jewish identity when it's under attack, rather than, when everything is dormant and there's no excitement. So, I think you get it both ways. I do fully understand and appreciate your perspective, which is that, when that happens, people don't want to go out and do things and don't want to identify Jewish. But I think at the end of the day, people will continue to identify Jewish, be active in communities, and be vigilant. And they are. There's been Homeland Security grants and concerns for synagogues, and it was more terror, attacks, real attacks on synagogues, which never really happened, to the best of my knowledge, in the past year. I mean, if you think back even, and here, I'll be just a little more cynical for a moment. If you think back 4 or 5 years ago, the greatest threat facing the Jewish community, which the entire Jewish community got like 99 senators to sign a declaration led by Pelosi, was that some half-baked idiot, or some who had mental deficiencies, was calling up JCCs from Ashkelon even, and telling them to evacuate because there's a bomb. Now, so you're telling me the greatest threat to anti-Semitism is some anti-Semite who was a Jew is trying to get Jews out of the building before it explodes. And we heard the same kind of language here. This was like crying wolf. It's like the 1930s. My Holocaust grandmother had to leave the JCC. She tripped on the way out. I mean, come on, let's have some perspective here. It's disruptive. It's scary. But what really happened? Not a lot. There was one copycat that actually killed people at a JCC. But let's get some perspective. When cemeteries are attacked, it's a terrible thing. But no new Jews are dying from attacks on cemeteries. And a lot of times it's drunk teenagers, or it's late at night, and it's not people that are hardcore anti-Semitists. And another thing is to keep in mind, and I do a lot of training with people from the foreign ministry in messaging and public speaking, and some of our ambassadors and consul generals. The problem with anti-Semitism is we've kind of lost its bang, and it's lost its definition. Why? Because in Israel, and I put a great slide up for the foreign ministry, I show a picture of George Soros, Victor Lieberman, Aryeh Deri, the UN Security Council, Hamas, and Jeremy Corbyn. And I say, the problem is that all these people are called anti-Semitic. All of them. Deri called Lieberman an anti-Semite. Lieberman called Deri an anti-Semite. Everyone thinks that George Soros is an anti-Semite and self-hating Jew. How anyone could use that term self-hating Jew and an anti-Semite, I don't know. So when the UN Security Council or Jeremy Corbyn or Hamas or neo-Nazis, the people that really want to kill Jews, were using the same terminology to describe someone that says we should boycott Israeli hummus and not eat Israeli hummus because they're bombing Gazans, including civilians right now. It's not serious. And we're not taking ourselves seriously because we can't have a serious discussion about these things. And we can't listen to what people have to say. And that's a problem.
That's definitely a refreshing perspective. I just to end off here, I wanted to hear from you what can be done to increase the person-to-person relationships between Israelis and Jews in the diaspora. I'll explain, because in 1948, one of the reasons you have such strong support for Israel is because everyone had a brother, a cousin, a niece, a nephew living in Israel, or those in Israel living in the diaspora. Now you have in Israel people who are 2-3 generations removed from anyone in the diaspora. You have these young Jews who often feel a connection to Israel, who also have not seen an Israeli relative in generations. What do you do to fix that and build a more connected future?
So one of the greatest things I think that's happening, and that's happened in the past 20 years, is the birthright program. There's no question. I can remember when I was working in the foreign ministry in the late 1990s, and Michael Steinhardt and Charles Bronfman came in for a meeting with the Yaakov Ne'eman, the then finance minister, and said, we're going to have this thing, and we're going to bring hundreds of thousands of Jews. Everyone's going to get a free ticket, and the Israeli government is going to help pay for this. And we're sitting there like, the Israeli government is not going to pay for this, and this is not going to work. No one's going to come on this trip. That's what I said. Not only was I wrong, but I think it's the greatest thing to get Americans or Jews from all over the world to come to Israel, to connect with their heritage, to connect with Israelis. I think it's very important. I think the fact that Israelis can see Americans, or not just Americans, but Jews from around the world, I think is really important. I think that's a great program. I think programs to kind of bring Israelis living in America, Israelis who are born in America, second and third generations Israelis, like you're involved in one of those organizations, is extremely important. And again, it goes back to our Israeli attitude for many years has been to dump on these people, to call them Yordim and children of Yordim, and to disrespect them and to not appreciate them. And I think that's changing. And I think that has to change, certainly because they're a great asset to Israel, because they're actually Israelis or Americans of Israeli heritage. And they actually know what's going on here. And they actually believe in Israel and defend it. And they're the first ones to get criticized. So recognizing that, I think, is really important. But I think the most important thing is that Israelis have to learn first to respect diaspora Jewry on the same level. And that's not happening. And at the same point, American Jews have to respect themselves and not be pushed around by Israelis to make them feel like second-class citizens. I think that there is a problem, that for the last 10, 15 years, the ultra-Orthodox have had a monopoly on so many things. That looks like it's changing. I think Facebook and these social media, which I'm not a big fan of these echo chamber social medias, but you get the perspective of people in different countries. And I have people that I know in different countries that I don't speak to regularly, and I see what they're thinking and what they're doing. And I think that's an important thing to see how they react to certain things, how we react. I think that's very important. So I do think that it is getting stronger rather than weaker. I think that travel and these programs like Birthright are fantastic in doing that, social media. But again, I think we have to put more emphasis on it. And instead of, diaspora Jewry, as you said in the beginning, giving us carrots and we're hitting them all the time with the sticks, I think we have to have more of we have to be on the same level if we want to have a conversation and do that.
Mitchell Barak, founding director and CEO of Kivunim Polling, Uber Pollster. Thank you so much. This has been a really eye-opening talk to hear your perspectives, and I very much hope we get to see each other in person.
I hope so too, and I thank you for hosting me. I enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to speaking again and continuing it in person as well, either in North America or in Israel, wherever we come first.
Amen.